Good morning, everyone. Good morning for the esteemed guests as well. It's a profound honor to be here, and I guess it's a very timely and important discussion that we are going to actually discuss today. Please allow me to introduce my panelists, esteemed guests. On my right, Michael C. Ryan, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy, U.S. Department of Defense from 2019 to 2020. And next to him is Oleksandr Merezhko, member of the Ukrainian Parliament. Next to him, George Bogden, Olin Fellow, Columbia University. And next to him, Troup, Hemenway, and he's a senior advisor and associate director at the Heritage Foundation for the Project 2025. And we should start, I guess, our very, very important topic and panel. Let's dive into it. We're going to discuss the implication of the US presidential elections, which is right around the corner. I would love to ask you guys, what are your opinion? What are the implications of the next 2.0 Biden administration or the next 2.0 Trump administration on the situation in Ukraine? Michael?
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to add my thanks to everyone else, especially to Alexei for organizing Black Sea Security Forum. It's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, let's talk about the Trump 2.0 administration, because it seems everyone in the world has a personal opinion about Mr. Trump, and it seems to be emotional. Let's just set that aside and focus on substance, not style, because the future of Ukraine depends on how well we attack the substance. So I want to provide a few data points from history, because as the famous American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. So the only way we can predict the future is look to the past. So let's talk about U.S. forces in Europe under recent U.S. presidents. It was President Obama that took 2 armored brigade combat teams out of Europe with very little consultation with anyone. President Trump never took any forces out of Europe. He wanted to take 12,000 out of Germany because he didn't think Germany was paying enough, but he didn't care where they went. And so the SACEUR at the time, General Walters, developed a new strategic force posture on behalf of President Trump that actually sought to move F-16s from Germany down to Italy so they would be closer to the Black Sea, to move American rotational heavy forces down into MK Air Base in Romania, which of course we all know is on the Black Sea, and actually move the headquarters of U.S. European Command to be co-located with its NATO counterpart at Schiphol and Mons, Belgium. The most important thing we could do, I think, for European security. He was also the first president to authorize lethal assistance to Ukraine. Pretty important. And then let's look at NATO, because very famously he was opposed to NATO. Well, he actually wasn't. He was opposed, as every U.S. president since Eisenhower was opposed, to Europeans not paying enough for their own security. That situation has changed remarkably, in many ways, thanks to President Trump. In 2019, at the London Leaders Meeting of NATO, when I was there, it was President Trump that actually took President Macron to task over saying NATO was brain dead. So President Trump was actually advocating for a stronger NATO at the time. So he came a long way in a very short period of time. Why? Well, the economics are compelling. You know, he's a businessman, trained in New York real estate, which is one of the toughest business environments, and he has a different mentality. But the economics of the case are compelling. The transatlantic economy is compelling when it comes to the defense of Europe, because we own $19 trillion of assets in Europe. The United States does. That's compelling. The future of a free Ukraine is economically compelling because of the potential that Ukraine can contribute to the Western economy. And Ukrainian victory is compelling because in the end it's going to be a lot cheaper than the alternative. So that's very compelling. And we know President Trump likes to back a winner, and he likes to take credit for it. So as we move on a positive and upward vector in the defense of Ukraine on behalf of all of us, I think President Trump would be an outstanding advocate for future progress in that regard. So let's look back to the strategy that we pursued under the Trump administration. The biggest example of that is Exercise Defender, the return of strong and heavy U.S. forces to Europe, first time since the end of the Cold War. In 2020, we did that in Northern Europe. In 2021, we did it in Southern Europe through Albania. And so move forces to the Black Sea and towards Ukraine and exercise Defender. So now every year, in the even years it's in Eastern Europe, and in the odd years it's in Southern Europe. And so that contribution continues, and that was started then. When we think about strategy, we have to think about the battle of the narrative. So in the corrosive narrative, where the differences are sharpened, and so there's a great media push against the potential Trump 2.0 administration. Who gains from that? Well, the Russians and the Chinese, who are very much a part of stoking that debate. The opposing party and their media friends gains from that narrative. And those who are EU-centric, people that purport strategic autonomy for Europe, which I actually think is a good idea for everybody, but in partnership is the way to do it, not as the EU as a separate entity going its own way. And so they all benefit. So when we look to the future, we dissect the narrative and we look to the reality. I think in a 2.0 Trump presidency, there's a lot to look forward to. Of course, no one knows, so we'll have to see. The greatest thing to watch for in either a Biden 2.0 or Trump 2.0 is who's actually in the administration. Because it's the people who advise and the people who run the institutions, and the institutions who have to make the right decisions going forward and advise the president to do so. And that's going to be the key. If those people have a compelling case to make to the president and he listens to them because he trusts them, then it's going to work out fine in either administration. And if they don't have good people and he doesn't trust them, then it's not going to work, pure and simple. But again, no one knows. Thank you, Monica.
Oleksandr, how do you see the situation?
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to start by saying that we don't know, we cannot predict who will be the next American president, whether Biden remains or whether Trump will be elected. But to me, it's a sign of strength of democracy, because when we cannot predict the result of presidential election, it means that democracy, we have true democracy and we have true competition. But of course, if Donald Trump is elected as a president, there are lots of issues and questions which we can help but asking. First of all, I recall that in his book, John Bolton, he describes the following episode from Trump's career as a president. In the first phone conversation with the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, asked him a question: what are you going to do with Ukraine? And Trump, being already a president, he responded by sort of counter question: what are you going to do with Ukraine? And it's a very telling episode for us. Of course, each American president is supposed to have his or her doctrine, foreign political doctrine. And we wonder what kind of foreign policy doctrine will be if Trump is elected, what kind of doctrine he will have, and whether it will be different, first of all, from his first term, and whether it will be different from the foreign policy doctrine of Biden, especially with regard to Ukraine, whether it will be continuation because of some kind of inertia in policy, or whether it will be different. We don't have answer, and I suspect that even Trump himself doesn't have the answer what kind of foreign policy doctrine he will have and what his approach will be with regard to Ukraine. And I suspect that even Heritage Foundation doesn't have yet the answer to this question. But what we can see that there are two currents or two schools of thought in the entourage of the candidate to the presidency, Donald Trump. They're usually divided into two categories. The first one are referred to as Reaganites. These are Republicans, staunch Republicans, who are trying to follow values and principles of Reagan policy, who are trying to be tough. For example, to me, the representative of this current is Herbert McMaster. To him, China and Russia are two sides of the same evil. And that's why the United States should counter both sides of the same evil. At the same time, there is another current which is sometimes referred to as revisionists. Their sort of basic idea of their slogan is Asia First. What they say that the United States cannot doesn't have enough capabilities to fight on two fronts, in Europe and in Asia. That's why their slogan is Asia first. They say that the United States should concentrate on countering China, trying to prevent it from rising to a regional hegemon and later on a global hegemon. And in this regard, Ukraine should be left to Europe. This is the basic idea. There is a danger in this idea because there are also, luckily, very lonely voices saying something like this. In order to focus on China, to counter China, to build a set of alliances and coalitions against China, we need to reach a deal with Russia, for example, yes, and to leave Ukraine in the sphere of influence of Russia. This is very dangerous thinking, and I hope it will not prevail under any circumstances. At the same time, as for Trump, I more believe in institutions rather than personalities in the American power, because I will quote one of the analysts who once said that it's misperception when we believe that the closer a person is to the top of the social hierarchy, the more freedom it has. On the contrary, this person at the top of social hierarchy is very restricted in its freedom of action. There are lots of restraints, institutional restraints, and so on. And for this reason, we cannot say, by the way, that how to categorize Trump, whether he's definitely not internationalist, liberal internationalist, but he is not also isolationist. He is, I would call him a pragmatist or something like that. And the final point I would like to make, still there is something depends on the traits of his personal character. And I believe that for Trump, if he is elected as a president, Ukraine can become either a story, his personal story of his success, and he's a very ambitious person, and I believe it would be the best option, or a story of his personal failure in foreign policy. And then there will be a question raised, like under Truman administration, at that time the question was who lost China? Yes, and if the events go in bad direction because of the lack of adequate support, the question might be addressed to Trump, who lost Ukraine. And I hope he doesn't want something like that. So I'm optimistic, and my final point is that I believe that we should help him if he becomes a president, on this condition, of course. We should help him to make the story of Ukraine the story of Ukraine's success and his success as a politician. Thank you.
George, if we could have your opinion as well, your remarks on the question, that would be great, and even if you could reflect on the previous ones.
Of course. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I thank you so much for the invitation, to Lord Ashcroft and others for supporting the venue. And I just have to say I have kind of two quick points to make. The first is what I'll say is don't count your catastrophes before they hatch. And the second point I want to make is that foreign policy is often based on conjunctures. And I think these 2 points are crucial in the context of this panel because when I speak to my colleagues in Europe, across Europe, it's as though the sky is falling. Oh my goodness, there's this terrible chance that Trump will come back, so on and so forth. And they have all kinds of expectations. And I think there's one thing about President Trump that is consistent, and that is that he defies expectations. And one that really stood out to me as a young observer of his presidency was the juxtaposition between two phenomenon. The first, in the first 2 years of his presidency, was that there was this kind of belief that he was in the pocket of Russia. There was this collusion that had happened during the election and so on and so forth. And this, was a kind of cloud over his governance, right? And this was thoroughly investigated and much of the claims were set aside and so on and so forth. But at the same time that was taking place, you would hear anchors on the news talking about his attempt to achieve energy dominance. Now, energy dominance, you can have many different critiques of the policy. You can say it's incoherent with concern for the climate, so on and so forth. The one indisputable fact about energy dominance as a policy is that it is incredibly harmful to Russia. Okay, in the first year that President Trump pursued that policy, crude oil production in the United States went up by 38%, and the United States became very quickly the number one producer of oil in the world, and it still had its position in oil and natural gas. This, in a way, robbed President Putin of the excess that he gets from a tighter market in that area. His coffers were running thin. In some ways, I think it also deterred him from various misadventures. So I want to really make that clear that President Trump, I think, in some ways defies expectations, that we shouldn't necessarily hang on, our worst fears for the moment and wait and see, what precisely is going to take place, because sometimes what we see in the media is not always what is taking place behind the scenes in his foreign policy thinking. The second kind of set of points that I just want to make are about what I called conjuncture. What I mean by that is that it's easy to suggest that there's a document that will be produced that will tell you day to day what the president is going to do. It'll follow a formula. But in reality, I think that events tend to drive foreign policy much more than any sort of elaborate document or national security strategy. And so there are some deep, what I would call America First principles that as an observer of the movement I see recurring. And one of them, I think, really relates to the desire by the United States to deter actors like Russia. And I think President Trump, like many, observed what President Biden did in Afghanistan and saw the tremendous kind of upswing of permissive conduct by actors like Russia and China. And so I think that he'll recognize, among the many factors that he'll consider, the kind of danger of not deterring revanchist governments. The other, which was alluded to by some of the other panelists, was the relationship that Russia has developed with China. Since Xi has come into power in China, President Putin has visited him some 40 times. Matthew Pottinger, an extremely important official in President Trump's administration, has pointed out that the relationship that Xi has to Putin is a kind of centerpiece of Xi's foreign policy now. And so for he to be perceived as backing a loser, I think, would be a terrible loss for him. And so in many things, instrumental thinking can come into play. I don't think that it should be perceived necessarily as a net negative. But those are some of the aspects that I think would contribute to kind of future nexes of factors that might lead to a kind of different set of decisions than we might ordinarily presume, or that President Trump's immediate rhetoric might lead us to conclude. So those are my two main points, and I'm really looking forward to what Troup has to say.
Thank you so much, George. And Oleksandr was referring to the Heritage Foundation, that they might know or might not know the answer for these questions. We are lucky enough to have somebody here from the Heritage Foundation, so we can actually ask him. So if you could please, Troup, reflect on the previous opinions, that would be great. I guess we've heard a lot of interesting assessment on the possible 2.0 Trump administration.
Of course, and thank you all for hosting me, and it's a beautiful venue, and appreciate the other guys' candor as well. I'd like to start just by kind of countering the point that there isn't something of a Trump doctrine, and that he has generally maintained the policy of strategic ambiguity. And one thing that the president doesn't like is to have his hands tied, or to have options eliminated for him prior to some kind of deal being made. And him not speaking to kind of predefined outcomes gives him that flexibility and the opportunity to kind of come in and determine things with a little bit more flexibility. A few things that he has said already on the campaign trail is that he does want some kind of negotiated settlement to end the conflict. And complementary to that, he has maintained the point that we can't provide endless aid abroad, and that should be given out is with the expectation that it at some point be paid back, or that there is some clearly defined American interest in it and oversight for how those funds are spent. So that is some kind of already defined intended outcome from the president, and I would contrast that too with sitting President Biden and his administration of really not offering much beyond further involvement and direct engagement. And even in the last aid supplemental that was passed, the administration was expected to come up with some kind of strategy, and they failed to produce that. That's an additional counter to the point that one side has tried to articulate something while the other hasn't. And George brought up the position of America first, and that is one thing that you could clearly define as Trump's policy too. That has been described by a lot of people in D.C. as realism and restraint, kind of a spin on a more neoconservative take in national security that has dominated Washington for the past couple decades, and something that is trying to more focus on American priorities abroad.
Thank you so much. So I guess that all lead us to what the strategy is going to be, what the U.S.'s strategy going to be during the next administration, and let's hypothetically say it's going to be Trump. So let's go on that line. So wherever I travel or wherever I go, and I talk to people, there are lots of questions that, oh my God, just as you said, George, that what happens if Trump comes? Now let's see what we know, or what do you think the strategy is going to be toward Ukraine, and strictly on Ukraine and Ukrainian victory, and also on Russia. So I would love to have your opinion.
All right, I'll start. It's fundamental that all nations act in their own self-interest all the time without exception. And as George was pointing out events, and we look at the events of the last 4 years, and they affect all of our interests, and they highlight that all of our interests are interconnected, and the nexus of that interconnection is Ukraine and what's happening between Russia and China because of the situation in Ukraine. That is going to influence American strategy. One of the things that President Trump did so forcefully, as George again pointed out, was the use of American economic power, which has actually not been greatly brought to bear on the situation in the world. And so I think the strategy in all of our interests, the economically compelling strategy, will be to use American power to control the global price of oil so that we can drive our adversaries, both Russia and China, to do the things that we need them to do, but also to build on the alliances and the partnerships, because now we've seen in the last 8 to 10 years, allies are really stepping up to pay more. We look at what the Japanese are doing in the Pacific, moving their defense budget to 2.0. In NATO, the defense budgets at 2.0 is now a floor, not a ceiling, and they're going towards 3.0, and more allies are meeting their commitments. So the situation has fundamentally changed in the world, so that in a President Trump 2.0 administration, as Troup pointed out, he doesn't like to have constraints. Well, there's a lot more to work with now, and a lot of greater challenges that have to be dealt with, and therefore I think we'll see a more comprehensive, all elements of American national power working more coherently together to achieve the U.S. interests, but also the interests that are in all of our allies' best interest at the same time.
Thank you. It's hard to make any predictions, and risky and dangerous, but nevertheless, I would bet that at least initially, Trump's policy with respect to Ukraine will be pretty much the same as the policy of Biden. He will continue. But with the passage of time, I think that his policy will be tougher. As soon as he realizes that it makes absolutely no sense to even to try to find any deal with Putin, to strike any deal with Putin, his policy will be even tougher. Sorry.
Thank you. George?
I guess the two sort of sub-points that I would add to what my colleagues have already mentioned is that I think that from top to bottom in the foreign policy establishment and the sort of anti-establishment of the United States is a deep concern about the relationship between Russia and China. For example, the Council on Foreign Relations is currently conducting a study group. It's gone on for weeks and weeks, examining all aspects of that relationship. And I think in the newspapers of the United States, you see a kind of constant hum of discussion on that question. And I think there are kind of two kind of classical realist approaches to that kind of axis, right? Which is famously, as Dr. Kissinger proposed, you try to cleave, one actor from another, maybe the weaker one. And I think it's been very clear that that strategy isn't working in this case. But there's a kind of other strategy that I see emerging in kind of the talk of the United States kind of foreign policy folk, which is that you should try to make one actor in the relationship look particularly weak. And the striking thing about the Chinese-Russian relationship is that there are many commentators who want to see it as, together they are not that much stronger than just China, right? But the extraordinary thing about Russia is its nuclear stockpile, its kind of size geographically, and so on and so forth. So that debate will continue raging, and I think those surrounding President Trump will take a position about how to deal with this emerging axis, but that may be, quite significant to his approach. The one point that I do really want to just raise as well is pertaining to democracy, because it's my sense that the Biden administration has kind of taken an approach to the rhetoric of democracy abroad that's somewhat incoherent. So on the one hand, we have a deep emphasis on things like the Summit for Democracy, and yet simultaneously, President Biden will go and stump for, election reform in the United States and say, if we don't have this, democracy in the United States will just collapse. And so it's hard, I think, for those abroad to interpret, how can you be a leader on this subject and then simultaneously be facing this, terrible situation in your own system. I raise this because in some ways, discussion of Ukraine has been tied to the discussion about the kind of global preservation of democracy. And I think those around President Trump have some concern that that is to transform the conflict into a kind of proxy to say, people like President Trump are, behind the forces that are, undoing Ukraine. And I think that's the real transition rhetorically that you might see in the next administration. But that's conjecture on my part, and it's simply by reading as much as I can, as often as I can. But those are kind of my perceptions.
I'd second you, George, and it's usually a strategic blunder to drive two different challengers together into a closer relationship. Not often I'd agree with Kissinger, but I will in that regard. Monica, I'm trying to tie back to your initial question, and it's one that's harder to answer just because you need clarification on what victory exactly is. And we are still in a pretty fluid climate, and the November election is still some months away. Generally, Americans do want to see the war end, but it's not clear exactly how that's going to happen or whether or not lines are going to change. There is legitimate concern about escalation, drawing the United States into the conflict. Right now, there's most recent reporting on a Russian nuclear submarine with hypersonic missiles that disappeared off the coast of Florida. That's a concern for a lot of Americans. But regardless of the election, I think over to Ukrainians for thinking about their future and what peace could potentially look like.
So, and the next question would be, which is really tied to what you guys just mentioned, is a NATO summit. It's just right around the corner in Washington, D.C., and there are lots of questions around it. How do you see what is going to happen in Washington, D.C.? What are the perspectives of a possible NATO membership? And not just that, but in connection with that, security guarantees. It comes back to negotiated settlement as well when Trump comes. So, and even with the Biden administration, do we know? Do we see? Do you see anything at all? How the security guarantees could be drawn or drafted? How do you see that? And how do you see the NATO summit?
Thank you. So NATO, as the most successful military and political alliance in history, is an institution. In an institution, things take a long time, and to make progress requires forcing functions. The summit is a forcing function. What will be publicized as conclusions of the summit is agreed by all 32 members. The things that are not agreed are the things that you're referring to, because those are the challenges that we have not yet found a solution for. And that, as we know, there is opposition to NATO expansion to Ukraine and Georgia, particularly in Berlin. So that's a challenge that has to be overcome, that eventually will be overcome, but probably not by the summit. So the challenge is well known. The political challenge is well known. Progress will be made in many areas. The U.S.-Ukrainian security agreement is a way to set the stage, because the communique that will communicate the conclusions of the summit is now being drafted and being argued about in committees all day, every day. And that's a living document, and as events drive us to the summit, and what happens between now and then is going to be determinant on what the conclusions are, we'll get closer and closer. So I think you'll see language that from a Russian point of view is a security guarantee, but from a Ukrainian point of view is not, unfortunately. But it will be significant for the messaging that it gives on all the problems that we've discussed. So it is the 75th summit. It is in Washington where the treaty was signed. And it is occurring in an election year in the United States. And the point that I want to make is, in an election year, what the opposition candidate says will drive the incumbent to do things they may not otherwise want to do based on the will of the people. So I think that's what we have to watch, is how this summit affects the will of the populace in the United States towards actually making decisions that will drive these issues forward. And that will in turn drive the Biden administration to do more than they've done in the past, and to do so faster so that they can actually demonstrate success before the election, because that's one way to make sure that they win.
Thank you. Ideally, of course, we would like to get invitation to join NATO. And it is my deep conviction that Ukraine's full membership in NATO would stop the war of aggression, because Putin is scared of NATO. And he's a coward. He's a bully, but he's a coward. But I don't know how realistic it is to expect this. But still, I have deep down this hope that maybe at the last moment, Biden will decide to go down in history and make this gesture, historically important gesture. Who knows? At the same time, realistically speaking, I think that we need at least we need something bigger and more than what was achieved during the previous summit in Vilnius. At least we need a confirmation that our membership is inevitable, that it's just a question of time when Ukraine will become a full-fledged member of NATO. And we also expect some guarantees, reliable guarantees, before Ukraine joins NATO. And of course, more military aid and technical aid. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I'll just say briefly a few things. You know, I really, as someone working on a historical project now about the denuclearization of Ukraine, I look at the question of, you know, the frontier of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is kind of the grand prize that you get if you're a member of NATO. You know, it's the kind of three musketeers, all for one, one for all. You know, if anybody invades you, you are protected, right? I look at that as actually kind of an overstated guarantee in the grand scheme of things. And what informs this analysis is the fact that, you know, when various countries were giving up nuclear weapons that were placed on their territory by the Soviet Union, Belarus was the last to give theirs up. And what the Belarusian government and the Russian government in the time in the 1990s got out of NATO for finally getting these weapons out was the kind of proviso in the NATO-Russia Founding Act that no new admitted states to NATO would have nuclear weapons on their territory from the alliance. And so it's my perspective, I think, that Russia tends to care more deeply about where hard power resides than where kind of treaty provisions draw lines. And so I would just highlight for those in the room that may be a more consequential question. But at a deeper level, you know, I think also there's an unspoken reality within the alliance that it will take some time to go through a consolidation after the admission of Sweden and Finland. And I want to just raise a historical anecdote again, that Sweden heavily pressured the Finnish government to sign the treaty to ban landmines, the Ottawa Treaty. And famously, the Finnish president said to the Swedes, well, that's easy for you to say, Finland is your landmine. And later on, of course, there was the expression that the Swedes were happy to fight to the last Finn. And I mention these issues because I think people presume that the alliance can simply assume new entities within it and that things won't change. But different countries have different pasts, different strategic cultures, different awarenesses of their own kind of backgrounds and so on and so forth. And this is important and will be difficult for NATO to accommodate. So who knows what might happen next year? I raise those points.
Yeah, and that's a fair comment of whether or not NATO membership is more of a political statement or if it's a legitimate security treaty. And consider the fact that still so many of NATO members aren't meeting their 2% requirement. Underneath Trump, that began to change, and people were actually contributing their fair share. But even now, in active conflict in the European theater, a number of them still aren't. That's just astonishing to me. And about 75% of the aid that has gone to Ukraine so far has come from the United States. So consider that Europeans aren't proportionally supporting Ukraine. What would NATO membership in Article 5 guarantee in that consideration when their existing word doesn't amount to much?
My question would be, and this is the last question for you before I give the floor to the audience and they can have their questions. Can Ukraine fall victim of political games, just like we've seen it, the Ukraine aid with Speaker Johnson, and finally he put it on the floor, or just like Troup you mentioned, it's more like a political statement, the NATO membership as well. And also its campaign. And we've seen it in the European parliamentary elections as well, that Ukraine become integral part of the narratives. And apparently, and we all know that, it's part of the US elections narratives as well. So can Ukraine fall victim? And just like Oleksandr mentioned, Ukraine is just going to be left behind to Russia.
Well, thank God we all said that no one can predict the future. But I think in the context of your question about can Ukraine fall victim to the narrative, I would say probably not, because the narrative involves the ability of Europe to defend itself and to stand on its own, which the European Commission under President von der Leyen has taken on board quite robustly. And many nations in Europe have realized that the fate of Ukraine is their fate. And in the conflict so far, decisions in Europe have been driving decisions in Washington. Provision of tanks, provision of fighter aircraft, provision of longer-range missiles. And so in this case, the drive of Europeans and of the European Union to become a global actor commensurate with their economic might, which is significant, is really coming to the fore. It's a matter of timing. Can they do it fast enough? And can they do it robustly enough? Yes, as Troup said, the preponderance of contributions to Ukraine have been from the United States, but on a GDP per capita basis, we're like 14th. More European nations are stepping up in a greater way, giving from their substance than is the United States. So regardless of the debate in the United States and how the presidential election turns out, it's a now or never moment for Europe. And the trends, I think, are very positive in Europe in favor of Ukraine.
So do you think that even if the US just leaves us steps away, Europe would step up? Or would the US step away from Ukraine?
Well, I don't think the U.S. can step away from Ukraine because it goes back to the whole Russia-China alliance, but also the situation in the Middle East is affected by the situation in the Black Sea and the role of Turkey. And so when you start to connect all the dots and you look at it globally as the United States does from a security standpoint, you can't walk away. But I think Europe will continue to step up faster and more robustly than the United States out of necessity, because it's clearly in the European interest. And therefore, I'm guardedly optimistic that no one will walk away from Ukraine.
I believe that Ukraine cannot fall victim in a sense that it cannot lose the war, because look at the situation right now. The war has entered its third year, and Russia has failed to make significant territorial gains. So we have survived as a state, and we continue to fight. But what might happen, it's more a matter of price we have to pay for our defense and for our victory. And of course, if the aid will be cut short, or it will stop, the price in terms of human lives will be much higher. But in the final analysis, strategically, Russia has already lost this war. You know, we are talking right now about around 20% of our territory, you know, but we have survived basically. But of course, we want to save lives, and to do that, we need more adequate, and in terms of quantity and quality, military aid from the West.
You know, it's an election year. Everything is up for grabs. Unfortunately, I think almost every topic will become the subject of public jockeying. And so those who are advocates for Ukraine should be, I think, prepared to respond to arguments and counter-arguments for both sides. You know, I have to say, though, that this is a period in American history, I think, right in the lead up to elections, where politicians try to find easy, simple answers. And the last time President Biden was confronted with the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO, he said, oh, no, we want something different. We want the, quote, Israel model, end quote. And then events arose that have deeply questioned and laid tensions upon that arrangement that the United States has with Israel. And so a broader debate, I think, is going to be raised about the extent to which the United States is prepared to assist those who are treaty allies, those who are allies without treaty relations, and so on and so forth. And of course, hanging in the background is Taiwan, is another question that the administration has to respond to as tensions in the Pan-Pacific rise. And these are all related to each other because they are analogies and reciprocal kind of parallel examples. So.
Yeah, and that builds on what Michael was saying earlier of we see things from a global perspective, and Taiwan is one thing that's out there lingering and in the mind of the public, and if it's possible that China will try to take a move on it, in which case it's a situation where America doesn't want to be spread too thin on what we're providing globally in Europe and Israel and potentially over there too. But just purely from an elections perspective, foreign policy issues don't poll as a major consideration for voters. That's largely driven entirely by domestic issues. You can take into consideration that this administration has shepherded in 12 million some illegal aliens into the country. Crime is running rampant, and we're potentially nearing a recession. And if that happens for the United States, the globe is in pretty bad shape. So, and in short, I mean, that's what's going to be driving the cycle, is domestic issues, the economy, the border, and crime.
Thank you so much, but Troup, don't you think that domestic issues, when you mention all these, that also implies that the funds, as we have already heard it in several conversations, should not be funded Ukraine, but also only for domestic issues, and that's sort of a political gaming?
And that's contributed to some of the strain in Washington, D.C., where the Republican side has wanted some security for the border and other considerations like that, and it just hasn't been provided by the administration or really in any kind of a compromise with the Democrats. It gets very strenuous.
Thank you so much. And now the audience, please. Oh my God, lots of hands. So let's go in order. Please, the gentleman in the second row. Please introduce yourself and just
thank you very
name
much,
the panelists. Thank
Monica.
you.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Joseph from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and it's great to be here. Alexei, thank you for the invitation, and great to be here with other Americans. And I think the fact that we're all here as Americans is itself a demonstration of support for Ukraine. Monica, I have to speak here because on the panel, the esteemed audience here is getting an impression there's a remarkable unanimity among the panel about how benign a second Trump administration would be. So, Monica, just allow me to rattle off very quickly a few points to just make it a more interesting conversation, if nothing else. First of all, the audience should know that the election is far from assured. So you get the impression here that we're talking about a second Trump administration when we could very easily be talking about a second Biden administration in late November. So that's number one. Number two is to pay attention to the voices of those who know Donald Trump the best, those who have worked with him on national security, for example, like former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who remains extremely worried about a second Trump presidency and has said so, and who was personally, along with Mike Pompeo, so it's not only John Bolton, who was present at the NATO summit in 2018 and took Trump's threat to walk out of NATO quite seriously, and who points out the fact that Trump stated publicly, those who don't pay, let Russia do whatever the hell they want to the allies. And this brings me to the second point, is it's not just a question of cost. And Mike Ryan is absolutely correct. All presidents have pushed NATO allies on cost. Absolutely correct, Mike. But it's not about cost. It's about the understanding, the fundamental perception of Donald Trump that NATO doesn't really serve American interests. That's the difference here. And when we come to this question of great example here is Trump as a businessman. You tell me, Trump, how different would he be from the German business establishment that loves Russian cheap energy? And would Trump have taken the steps on Nord Stream, for example, or would he have listened to the viewpoint of a Schrader or German business, etc.? Then I'm coming to your key question, Monica.
Thank you.
Then finally, this point about Afghanistan, for example, the withdrawal, this was a Trump deal that Biden executed. Okay, let's be very clear, with a deadline on it. So that's the point about democratic inconsistency. President Biden would be wrong if he only talked about democracy in other countries and said nothing about challenges at home. And the point, this is the key point here, it's not some theoretical view. It's real realism. It's an understanding that the threats to instability come from autocratic countries like Russia, like China, like Serbia, like Hungary. Now, here's my question, last one.
Good.
How do we get to what Ukraine wants, which is its own sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peace, so that people, instead of dying, can go back to their families and building this country? Do you get to peace by signaling to Vladimir Putin, you know what, we really ought to cut a deal? Or do you signal to the way to get to peace is by signaling to Vladimir Putin that no matter what you try, we are here and to stand with Ukraine? And that's exactly what happened at the G7 just now with President Biden, and taking Russian funds to pay the interest on a very important $50 billion loan to Ukraine. So that's my viewpoint here, to sort of just give another perspective on this question.
Can you
Thank
please repeat your question?
Yes, my question is which approach is more effective to achieving the goal of a peaceful settlement that is in Ukraine's interest? Which approach? The one that says, you know what, Vladimir Putin, let's cut a deal. Let's be reasonable here. Or is it the approach that says, you know what, Vladimir Putin, we are here standing with Ukraine?
Perfect.
And that's the question.
Do you have a particular panelist you want to answer? Or
No, I do not.
Anyone?
Take a shot. Sure. Thank you, Edward. I'm glad you raised all those points. It's good to have a good, civil, open discussion about these, because you raised things that are very much in the press and very much on people's minds. Just very quickly, John Bolton was not America's sweetheart until he came out against President Trump. As a matter of fact, he was the devil incarnate. So I'm glad you lumped Mike Pompeo together with that, because he has more credibility in that regard. But I would point out that Secretary of Defense Mattis resigned over President Trump's desire to remove troops from Syria, and we still have troops in Syria. Having worked the Afghanistan deal in the Pentagon, the deal that President Trump started, was it a good deal? Was it a great deal? No, as Secretary Esper said, but it was a deal worth trying. The milestones that required the Taliban to do certain things were rigid, and just like the bombing of North Vietnam, had the Taliban not done what they were supposed to do, it would have been very bad for the Taliban. That was the plan, and that's what we were doing. So you have to look more deeply into that. Nord Stream, President Trump was against Nord Stream and tried to get the Germans to stop it. I think you can find that in the press as well. For 4 years under the Trump administration, President Putin behaved. Leave that. And as far as signaling, I think you can find in every country, in every walk of life, somebody that's pushing for a negotiated settlement. There you go. Now, rhetoric on the campaign trail, some of it's indefensible from all candidates, so I take your point there. As far as what can be done, and again, I go back to in the U.S. body politic, when I go around the country talking to people, if they see that we can win, they're going to go all in to win. But if they think we're losing, then they're going to want to get out. We won in Afghanistan. We had achieved what we set out to do in Afghanistan. We had a friendly government that would allow us to do anything. We had the largest strategic base in the world, south of Russia, west of China, east of Iran, and northwest of Pakistan when we're trying to make India our new best friend. And we walked away from that. So what signaling are we giving through our internal debates? I think the most important signal that we can give, to answer your question, is that there's a pathway to victory in Ukraine. And this is all it takes. And the cost of losing is going to be significant. That message, I think, will get to where we want to be, regardless of people's political perspectives on all the other issues you raised. And thank you again for raising them.
Yeah, very quickly, to me the answer is obvious. We need to respond with the position of strength to each Putin's provocation. And look at the example of Finland. When Finland joined NATO, there was practically no reaction from Putin. He couldn't do anything. He didn't basically say anything. So it's example that when he had dealt with from the position of strength, he's afraid to make any provocations.
George?
I think my colleagues have touched on so many of the points that you raised. I would just make 2 points. That the first, your characterization of President Trump as similar to German businessmen is really extraordinary. I mean, he spent much of his first administration railing against Nord Stream 2, talking about Germany's addiction to Russia's oil and natural gas. And this was treated in most foreign policy circles that I was affiliated with as just sort of ludicrous anti-German beliefs and so on and so forth. He effectively sanctioned Nord Stream 2. And I will never forget, as someone who studies Europe, watching Secretary Blinken in his confirmation hearing describe Nord Stream 2 as a fait accompli. Extraordinary. The dichotomy between the administrations is clear. The cynicism of one, the latter, over the other, I think is very clear. I also would just say that the two dichotomous approaches to negotiation that you lay out are of course, neither of them would be effective. And negotiations are about duplicity in some sense. And so when we listen to President Trump's positions about various negotiation tactics he might pursue, we have to recognize that his actions are what we should judge him on in this very difficult situation.
Yeah, and George brought it up earlier too. I mean, American energy production was at a height in 2020, and it was at that point supplementing Russian oil in the continent as well. Of course, the Biden administration came in, and their war on fossil fuels shuttered all of that, and that debilitates the American ability to project power abroad across the board. And he's like, there were no new conflicts underneath President Trump. That is very notable. The Afghanistan withdrawal, that's another conversation. There was some kind of recommendations put in place, and you go back and you speak with some of the individuals that were working on them, and they can point to how the Biden administration botched them too. There's been a hand raised toward the left for this whole conversation.
Well, I'm so sorry.
My name is Yuri Tabak, and
I'm so sorry, but we are out of time, and I have to let you all go. That's okay. Okay.
I'm Yuri Tabak, and I'm a retired U.S. naval officer. My last job was I was the chief of staff for the NATO representation in Moscow, and my question is I wonder how many of us would showed up here if for years somebody would kept saying in every news, in every media, in every panel that Odesa is going to be bombed, if Odesa is going to be attacked on a daily basis, if Russian Marines are going to land in Odesa. I think many of us would question why, I mean, there's something wrong. Why should we come here? Maybe we should go to the Carpathian Mountains or Lviv or something like that. And where I'm leading to is, my question is, why are we all nonstop concerned what happens if Trump becomes a president? Nobody, sir, asks a question, what happens if Trump doesn't become a president? I have been in the Ukrainian media on a daily basis, not once, for the last 3 years. Anybody asked me a question, what happens if Trump doesn't become a president? If we continue the way we are with President Biden or Kamala Harris, what happens then? I think ordinary people get scared, saying there's something wrong with President Trump. That's why we shouldn't have him, because everybody's concerned what happens if he becomes a president. And everything is okay with President Biden, Kamala Harris, because nobody ever asks that question. Everybody's happy with that, right? So my question is, why is that today we have a panel that is concerned with the presidency of President Trump, who has already been president, by the way, and not concerned with what happens if he's not a president? So my question to you, honorable gentlemen, what happens if President Biden remains a president? What happens to Ukraine then?
That's an excellent question. We touched on it, but I guess it was too short. So, gentlemen, if you would like to elaborate on it.
No, thank you for the question. Thank you for clarifying that. As a great American proverb, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. And because we know that, we talked about the other possibility. Because I think you'll get more of the same if President Biden's reelected. And do you like that?
It's a hard question to answer, to tell you the truth. But, it seems like the things will continue the way it is. Yeah, the same situation will be. And the only problem, why we're talking about Trump and possibility that he might become a president, because Biden's administration policy is more or less predictable. And to me personally, Trump remains an enigma, sort of, wrapped in a mystery. Yes, and that's why we're talking. It's natural. And the second reason, in politics, to me, Trump looks like a rock star. You know, he's very flamboyant. So he's worthwhile to be talked about, I think.
George?
I mean, I would just raise the title of the panel, right? Which seemed to point us in the direction of discussing President Trump. But, you know, perhaps I'm mistaken there. The other point I'll just kind of make very briefly is that there's a famous political scientist in America, Peter Feaver, who said that the U.S. government lobotomizes itself once every 4 years. And he didn't add the caveat that if there's an incumbent who wins again, you know, there's no lobotomy, right? There's a switch out, massive switch out of people in the administration. And there are countless people in President Biden's administration who are probably very burned out, who've had enough fun to last a lifetime. So I mention this because to presume that you will have the same policy go on is perhaps a mistaken presumption as well.
I think Michael had a right interpretation of more of the same. And I touched on this in my initial response, is that there hasn't been any kind of clear policy articulation by the sitting administration. And if Clausewitz has told us anything, is war is what's the exact quote? War is an extension of politics by other means. Like if you don't have some kind of perceived outcome in mind, it's only going to escalate from there. You could probably expect more of that under the Biden team.
Thank you. There is one more question, I guess.
Okay. Csaba Horváth from...
Sorry, the gentleman behind. I'm sorry. It was just, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry.
Can't I ask my question? Excuse me.
I'm sorry, can we, yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Dr. Horvath. I actually have a quick question for Troup, and it actually was inspired by something that Michael said. He brought up the Syria withdrawal, how President Trump wanted to withdraw from Syria in 2018. As we know now, that was undermined by in some cases Trump appointees, but members of the permanent national security bureaucracy that undermined his decision. And throughout his presidency, you saw efforts by either his appointees or the permanent national security bureaucracy to undermine his foreign policy preferences. You're working on a personnel project designed to shape the next Republican presidency, which is going to be President Trump. Do you think this is going to be a problem in a second Trump administration where you have appointees working against their president?
I, of course, can't speak for the president, and our project can offer recommendations, and they can potentially accept those or not. I would not anticipate that same kind of a concern that was experienced in the first administration. There is and this is another component of the dialogue in D.C. and elsewhere surrounding the election of the administrative state or the deep state or however you want to designate it, of a massive 10 million plus person bureaucracy that's on autopilot for its own prerogatives in place of whatever it is of the president's agenda and what was then just elected by the American people. I would anticipate some lessons learned coming out of the last administration if they're given the opportunity for a new one, just that's been polished and tested and now ready to govern more effectively.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for all participating in the panel. And keep getting messages that we have to finish, so I'm so sorry that we cannot take more questions, but thank you so much for all being here. Thank you, and thank you so much for our expert panelists as well.